Thank you and good morning. It is nice to be in sunny Winnipeg after the winter and cool spring in Vancouver for sure. So I want to thank the Council and the Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity for Deloitte to be involved in this event. And just a quick plug for Deloitte. We're one of the largest professional advisory firms in Canada, and we have a national infrastructure and capital projects team that is devoted to assisting clients as they look at infrastructure projects and alternative ways to deliver them. Just want to have a shout out for a few other Deloitte folks here. We have Dean Schinkel, who's our managing partner in Winnipeg here today. Bing Bing Wang, who is here as well, and Bing Bing's involved with a project called Clear Sky Communications. Maybe hear more about that later on. And we have Kanish Badia here as well. Kanish was quite involved with the City of Winnipeg on the Southwest Transitway project. And you've heard from Sod already. So, well, before we get into the value for money discussion, I thought, given we have such a large audience at various levels of experience with P3s, that we may start off with just a couple of slides just to remind folks what P3s are and the different forms of them. You heard a couple of definitions this morning, but here's a few more. One's from the Canadian Council for P3. P3 is a cooperative venture between public and private sectors built on the expertise of each partner that best meets clearly defined public needs through appropriate allocation of resources, risks, and rewards. So, pretty broad definition. Another definition, P3 Canada, a P3 is a contractual relationship between a public authority and the private sector, which involves a long-term duration, the provision of goods and services to meet a defined output specification, and a transfer of risk to the private sector anchored in private sector capital at risk. And in Canada, P3s are very specific, I think. They definitely relate to the provision of a public purpose infrastructure and related services. And I think the other hallmark for sure in Canada is that it necessitates a transfer of risk between the partners, both public and private. So you've probably all seen this delivery model spectrum before, but I'll just highlight it quickly. When you think about how infrastructure is delivered, there's actually a very wide range of different methods. And if you line these methods up on a spectrum that looks at the amount of responsibility or risk that of the private sector involved with the project, you get a spectrum like this. And you can start off on the right-hand side with more traditional methods like design, bid, build. I think everyone's familiar with those methods where infrastructure project is designed, then goes out for public tender, and usually the low-cost contractor wins the job and it's built, and then government operates and maintains it. And then you move a bit beyond that into design build, still relatively traditional, especially when governments are paying for a design build project on a progress payment basis. And then the other end of the spectrum, on the left-hand side, you see private sector, more fully private sector arrangements, concessions. And so Highway 407 in Toronto would be a good example of a full private sector privatized highway under a long-term 99-year lease. And you got this group of different methods in the middle here, which really represents the public-private partnership. And it's where you start combining the design and the build, as well as some of the other elements that transfer risk around maintenance, operations, and anchored in financing. So we have, there's a few acronyms here, DBF, that's a design build with short-term financing so that the owner doesn't actually pay for the project till it's up and running and performing. You get design build with operations and maintenance bundled into that contract. And then you move into design build finance maintain, or DBFMs or DBFOMs, where it's really the full suite of elements of a project that are bundled together in a long-term contract. Those are what we call public-private partnerships in Canada. I think some other hallmarks of P3s is the procurement process itself. And I'm just going to tease out a few of these characteristics of projects because they'll come up later in our panel discussion. But again, typically in Canada, we see P3 projects procured through a two-stage process. An RFQ, narrow down to 3, and then you run a proposal process. I think the other key characteristic of P3s in Canada in terms of how they're procured is the interaction between the owner, a government, and the private sector during the procurement process. We typically release the project agreement in draft form as the RFP goes out. And then during that open period when the project's being bid on, there's a series of interactions with the bidders. We call those collaborative meetings or commercial confidential meetings, where there's a lot of discussion with the private sector trying to optimize how risk is transferred through the project agreement. I think that's a key characteristic of what we see in terms of P3s in Canada. So, what is value for money? I think value for money means many different things to each of us in our business lives and our personal lives. I called my wife last night after I got into Winnipeg, and I said I was going to talk about value for money, and she was cleaning up after dinner from our 3 kids. And she said, you know, value for money? I don't think we're getting good value out of the allowance we're paying our kids to do chores in the house. So, and I couldn't argue with her since I was in Winnipeg and she was in Vancouver and I wasn't there to help out. So, but yeah, it means many things to different people. But in the context of a P3 arrangement, it's a very specific calculation. It really is a calculation that aids in decision-making about how you proceed with a project. So the key features of this calculation is a comparison between traditional delivery methods and a P3 model. And we often call the traditional delivery method a public sector comparator when we're doing this value for money analysis. It's a net present value calculation over a time frame of 25 to 30 years to try and capture the whole life of the project. It includes all direct costs of a project, capital costs, operating costs, transaction costs, costs of financing, costs of major maintenance, and rehabilitation. So it's kind of an all-in cost analysis. It includes actually a cost for risk. So we need to consider how these different models allocate risk and how that risk is being priced in the two different methods. And also includes a few adjustments to make it a fair comparison. We call that a competitive neutrality adjustment. And I think as you look at the value for money analysis that's done by different jurisdictions across Canada, they all have these common elements to them. There are some variations though, and the agencies of Infrastructure Ontario and SAS Builds and Partnerships BC, they all have slight nuances in how they do these calculations, but essentially fairly consistent. And this next slide is, you may have a hard time reading it, but this is kind of the output of a value for money analysis, where you basically, these graphs represent, or bar charts represent the calculation of a value for money with the public sector comparator, the PSC, compared to the PPP. And you'll see all the different components here: construction costs, operating costs, major maintenance, financing, transaction costs, and risk adjustments. And the graph on the right-hand side would represent a case where you have positive value for money. So the all-in cost of the P3 is less than the cost of the public sector comparator. And whereas on the left-hand side, that's a negative value for money, where the P3 is actually being costed out a higher cost than traditional delivery. And this calculation is typically done at least twice on a major project. You do it once during the business case phase when you're trying to make the case or see if P3s are an appropriate delivery model for your asset. You know, it's not always the case, so it's important to do that analysis up front. And then it's also done at the end when you have that preferred proponent bidder. And then instead of comparing two cost estimates, you're comparing a cost estimate to a real bid. And what we see is often the various procurement agencies across Canada, they'll produce the value for money result at the conclusion of the procurement process. So we'll just talk a little bit about the components, or some of the key considerations in this calculation. So the first one is deals with kind of the nuts and bolts, the construction costs, the major maintenance costs, life cycle costs. The starting point for this analysis is an assumption that those costs are going to be the same. And then I think what happens is there's more in-depth analysis looking at, well, where are the areas for innovation? What's the track record of cost savings through the P3 model? And there's an estimate of what potential cost savings may exist in the P3. The other important consideration in this part of the calculation is what are the additional costs of a P3? This isn't all about cost savings. There actually are additional costs in the P3, such as the ongoing cost of the entity, the special purpose vehicle, over that 25, 30-year period. They've got costs associated with running that SPV, whether it's legal or audit costs, and we'll hear more about that later on. We also have the financing costs, another key component. The key difference in this analysis is the cost of capital, the public sector's cost of capital versus the cost of capital in a P3. And it's important to also consider the discount rate you're using in this analysis. And if we're discounting at the same cost of capital as the public sector, then that kind of negates that impact of the cost of public sector capital. The other thing to include in the P3 is that not only just the difference in financing costs, so the base rate difference and the credit spread difference, but also the transactional fees that exist in the P3 private financing model. We also have transaction costs that need to be considered, and quite often when Canadian jurisdictions run P3 procurements, they include an honorarium. So that's an additional cost of the procurement process under the P3 that needs to be included. And then competitive neutrality, I mentioned that earlier, kind of adjusts for anything that would cause an unfair comparison of the models. A good example is self-insurance. A lot of governments don't take out specific insurance for their infrastructure assets. They're collected through a self-insurance of the government, whereas in the P3 model, there's sometimes specific insurance required, so we need to make some adjustments there so we have a fair comparison. Now, one of the other key differences or key parts of this calculation is risk adjustment. And this is often this is more the art than a science sometimes. It's subject to some criticism from various auditor generals across the land. But essentially, it's an exercise where you try and estimate what the risk profile of a project is, what are the key elements of risk of that project, not just considering construction, but over its whole life. And then figuring out, well, what is the allocation of that risk under the different models? And is that risk better managed or mitigated, depending on who's carrying that risk? And so this exercise usually involves risk workshops. We get folks around the table that are experienced with the asset in question and the experiences within government and in the private sector with the delivery models. And we take views on what's the probability of certain risks occurring and what's the possible impact. And we come up with an estimate of risk, and we look at what risk is retained by government under a traditional model, and what risk could be allocated or transferred through the P3. And then we use some Monte Carlo analysis, and we come up with the total cost of risk. And that's how we come up with a true quantification of risk. So before I move to our panelists, I wanted to just bring this home a little bit in terms of value for money being a calculation. And as I said earlier, almost all provincial agencies or municipalities that embark on P3s, are usually some kind of disclosure when the deal is done as to what the value for money achieved is. This chart might be a little hard to read. I can hardly read it here, but it's looking at a kind of a snapshot of relatively recent projects over the last few years across Canada. And trying to look at also across different jurisdictions to look at what level of value for money has been achieved. And I'll just pull out two projects that are relevant, I think, to today. One of them is the Southwest Rapid Transitway project here in Winnipeg. It had a value for money, percentage-wise, somewhere around 17%. So that difference between the PSC and what the actual bid that came in, there was a 17% cost savings. I think Mayor Bowman had mentioned the number of over $100 million today. But on a $440 million project, 17% is quite a savings. And then I think the other project that might be relevant here is after the Premier's announcement is the Joint Schools project in Saskatchewan. Again, it had a value for money calculation of about 13% with the final bid, and that's on a capital project in the $200 million range. So again, you know, this is material savings. And there's a whole range of other projects here. This graph actually nicely shows the range of projects that P3s have been applied on in Canada transit projects, hospital projects, water, wastewater, you name it. Almost every infrastructure asset, I think, in Canada has attempted a P3 and successfully procured it. So with that, that's an introduction to value for money. I'm now going to move over and have a seat and talk to the panelists about it. Is my mic working? Yes? Oh, no, it's great. So we're here with an excellent panel. And excellent not because they're just great people, but because I think we've covered the full range of perspectives on these projects. So we have Marianne Smith from Blake's, a partner at Blake's, involved in several projects, even the Southwest Transitway project here in Winnipeg. And we have Michael Gabert from BTY, experience as lenders, technical advisor, and also technical advisor to owners. And I think you were involved in projects such as the schools project in Saskatoon, or Saskatchewan. And we have Olivia MacAngus here from Plenary Group, so we have a developer's perspective on the project as well. So welcome, panel. And so you've heard me ramble on here about what value for money is. I'd be curious to start off here with kind of a broad-ranging question. From your individual experiences, where do you see value created through the P3 model? And maybe we'll start with Marianne and kind of work our way down.
Sure. As the lawyer on the VFM panel, I'll try to stick to what I know. For me, I think as part of a P3 project, it's a couple of things. One, it's the competition in the competitive procurement process that really drives innovation. So as Mark mentioned earlier, because for the most part these projects are structured in two phases. There's a pre-qualification phase and then the actual RFP phase. The owner knows that once you get to the RFP phase, the 3 or 4 teams who are pre-qualified can actually deliver the project. They've verified all their credentials, their financial creditworthiness, so all of those things are already taken care of. And so then you really drive for value through design innovation, engineering innovation, and financial value. And so for me, the competition aspect of these projects really helps to drive value because we try as much as possible to take care of the credentials and the more subjective things at the RFQ phase, and the RFP really is about the private sector's ability to take those requirements in the direction that they see drives the most value because, you know, frankly, it's in that competition where the public sector really sees the fruits of their labor, how people allocate their risk dollars in terms of the risk allocation that's set out in the commercial transaction, how people deal with the technical or other challenges in the project. That's really the part of the process which is geared towards driving value.
Michael?
Yeah, one of the biggest areas I think that you get value out of is bringing together the consortium team where you have the designers, the contractors, and the facility or service providers working together as a team right from the get-go instead of in individual silos, and then dealing with what each person has developed throughout. So you come together at the beginning and you're considering all aspects of the project that has to be developed. You know, you're going to have the service provider looking at what's going to be the most efficient way to operate and maintain this building over the term of the contract. The contractor is looking at the constructability, the schedule constraints, the means and methods, and the design team is feeding into with these teams together instead of having individual teams all at the start. So you get that together and you have a collaborative effort where they're looking to maximize the efficiency of the building, and they will look at options where you may be spending more money up front in terms of the capital costing to realize a bigger return over the operating term of the asset, which is something that can often be overlooked during the traditional procurement routes. I find that's a great value add.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to touch on that, what you're trying to get with value for money when you're looking at it is where across these projects can we find savings by transferring risk from the taxpayer to Project Co. And so, you know, I think that there are a number of ways that we've seen in Canada and the US of doing that, and we can talk about some specific examples, but there are also some places where actually Project Co is not in a better position than the taxpayer to take risk on things. And so I think that, part of this analysis that Mark does is to really start to look into the areas where, Project Co is better placed than the government to take on certain risks, and to allocate those risks to Project Co. And then where it's not the case, to sort of be realistic about that. So for example, environmental risk is probably one of those ones where, Project Co, we're good, but we're not magicians. We can't foresee if there's going to be environmental contamination. So asking Project Co to take risk on environmental contamination is probably going to be quite an expensive thing to do, because we don't have a crystal ball, and we can't foresee necessarily what the cost of that is going to be. So these are some of the things that the VFM analysis looks to do, is look at, where do you allocate risks, and some things that we're very good at are managing construction risk, managing construction schedule. And so, if you're a municipality and you haven't done a lot of $100 million projects or $200 million projects, I think that the P3 model provides you with a process and a contract that actually does transfer those risks very well, and the value has been realized, I think, across the board in Canada on that risk transfer.
Okay, that's really helpful. I think, wouldn't mind drilling in a little bit. I do believe one of the hallmarks of the Canadian P3 process is the CCMs, this interaction between bidders and the government sponsor during a in-procurement project. And I wonder if Marianne and Olivia, if you could talk about talk about the strength of competition to bring value, the risk transfer. I think a lot of this comes through, a lot of this value creation comes through during that procurement process and the CCMs. I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on kind of how you see that process from your perspective. So Marianne would see it a lot from the owner's side, and Olivia as a bidder, sitting in on those CCM meetings. So,
I think the value really in the CCM process is that you're driving the decision making around the design of the asset, and so obviously, there are rules of procurement in these P3 procurements that we see in Canada. They're very well established rules, and generally speaking, we find them to be very predictable, I guess, in a good way, and quite transparent. And so what we're trying to do as bidders is understand what are the needs that the community has from this asset, and what are really the value drivers for the taxpayer and for the government. And then we're trying to bring design solutions that will allow us to save money on the asset over the long term. And so the way that we win these projects in a competitive environment is, we're looking for savings across the project, not just on the capital side, but also on the operations and maintenance side, and being able to get feedback from the client during that process is really key to making the right decisions for the community.
That's a good point. Yeah, the CCMs are really not just about the project agreement and that risk allocation, but there's also a lot of interaction on the design components too, to see if they're making the requirements. Yep. Any insights, Marianne?
I think from the public sector side, one of the real values of those processes is first and foremost to make sure that they have a bankable, financeable deal that's on the table, to get feedback on areas where perhaps the risk allocation is inappropriate and why it's inappropriate. There's always a tension in these projects between the public sector owner who is striving for price certainty and wants a cost that includes as much risk transfer as possible, because that helps them from a budget perspective to know how much this project is going to cost in the long run. But also to make sure that, frankly, that we keep all those bid teams engaged to the end of the process, that we don't end up, these processes, as many of you in this room know, go on for quite some time. People invest a significant amount of resources in the process, and what we don't want is we don't want to end up at the end of the process where someone submits a bid that's not compliant, that we have to fail. That's a failure of the process. So we're really, or someone decides not to bid because they believe the risk allocation is either not financeable or not financially viable. Those are disaster scenarios for the public sector, having spent all of this time and money on the process. So we really use that time during both the design and the commercial meetings to get very valuable feedback. It's kind of like a negotiation, except it happens with 3 different parties in the middle of a procurement process. And so we get a fixed price, and effectively we get a deal, and there's little to no negotiation at the end with the winner. The winner is the winner, and the price is the price.
Okay, well, let's go converse, and let's talk about, well, what, in terms of the P3 process, what would be things that would destroy value for money? Giving some examples of kind of processes or projects you've been in and where you've seen, seen things that have actually taken away value more than provided it. And maybe, Michelle, I wonder if you could start with that one maybe, and around specifications perhaps?
Yeah, one of the biggest ways to remove value for money is to overspecify a project, which in turn then mitigates the proponent's team's ability to bring innovation to the project. You end up with, instead of having potentially 3 very unique and competing bids from everything from the financial to the construction, design, and operation standpoint, to 3 identical bids, because you've taken away that ability for the teams to come together and provide an innovative or unique solution, whether it be on the construction side or on the operations side. And that's something to very much watch out for in that process.
It's one of the more difficult parts, I think, of these projects too, is to get that output specification defined. Any kind of experiences with that? Are you generally seeing output specifications defined in a way that creates value, or are we still have a ways to go there in the Canadian marketplace?
We're probably, we probably started out a little further along down the curve, and I would say are coming back to more standardization and probably less innovation in the mature markets, and I think it's a trade-off, right? So from a government perspective, obviously once you have a certain amount of deal flow, I think greater standardization does provide some benefits. However, I think from an innovation perspective, the P3 process can yield very interesting outcomes if you have a process that will allow that innovation. So I can give some specific examples of that. We have a project in Pennsylvania, which is a project to replace 558 structurally deficient bridges in just over 3 years. And so these are really interesting challenges for governments, and using the P3 approach allowed them to dramatically shorten the delivery time frame. But the fact that they had a process that was quite open to innovation also allowed us to have huge savings on things like bridge deckings, which the team was able to put together a solution that outperformed the specification that the client gave us. And so we reduced the operating and maintenance costs on those facilities substantially, and it did provide us with a competitive advantage that ultimately gave us a win on that project, and I think also provided a win for the taxpayer, which is really what you're looking for, because at the end of the day, we have a P3 term that goes for 30 years, but beyond that 30 years, the asset still belongs to the taxpayer. And so are those assets better quality? Are they performing better? And I think the answer across the board on these P3 projects is yes. And then, your operating margins, can you allow more innovation and up the benefits of that?
I mean, we spend a tremendous amount of time talking about output specs in these projects, and as much as I adore the project agreement and how beautifully all of our project agreements are written, that really these projects live and die on the output specs. That's what I preach to the technical teams on every one of my projects over and over again. And it really is true. I think from the public sector side, there are some challenges with this model. First of all, most public sector entities are not used to an output-based model. And so it becomes tremendously difficult to change people's mindset in terms of the traditional way that they do projects versus this output-based model. And one of the things, in addition to the technical issues that that raises, is there's a governance issue. Decisions have to be made, in some cases, before you ever would traditionally make decisions about things like life cycle and maintenance. In a traditional project, you build the project and worry about all those things later. And that doesn't happen on a P3 project. And so the output spec is something that changes throughout the competitive procurement process as we get feedback, as decisions are made, as changes are made, and it is an indicator of how well a project is going to go, for sure, and that's why so much time and attention is spent there. But it is also making sure that as the public sector owner, you have some confidence in your spec that it is going to deliver what you want, maybe not exactly how you envisioned it in your mind, because we don't always get the design we had in our mind, which is also another governance issue, especially for those of you who go to present indicative designs to decision makers. That always makes me nervous, because you might not the building might not be that color when it's done. But for the most part, that's why we spend so much time on the spec. And it is for the public sector embarking on a project like this, oftentimes it is something that they think that a spec writer is going to take care of, but it's actually a collection of thousands of individual decisions. It's better to think of it that way.
I would say that's probably a hugely underreported value of P3s, is that it actually requires governments to think about what it is they need ahead of procurement, which is, it sounds logical, right? But it's not something that is necessarily common practice.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. This value for money methodology, I've presented in the context of P3, but it actually it's a good methodology for any project, even a traditional project, to go through the exercise of a risk analysis, identify your risks, trying to quantify them.
Have a capital budget and an operating budget.
Exactly, yeah. Michael, is there anything you want to add to that discussion around?
I think when you're touching on the output specs, and you think about handback requirements as well, and you think about the operations and maintenance and life cycle rehabilitation of the project over the term, the project or the service provider is financially incentivized to complete the maintenance, to operate the building or the asset, whichever it may be, as per the requirements, and then life cycle it and hand it back in a specific condition. And if you manage that handback requirements properly, you end up with a very solid asset at the end of its operating term. And they don't have the ability to do deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance generally incurs a penalty. The more penalties that are incurred, the less money the service provider is making. And also it opens up the opportunity for step-in rights on the procuring authority. So I think there's a carrot and stick methodology there that isn't seen in the public sector in traditional procurement routes that you do see in the P3 route. That adds a lot of value to the project.
So we've talked about value for money, a very specific calculation and various elements to that. I often think we should be thinking broader about these projects. There is a lot more value than just sometimes this calculation shows. So I wonder if we could just talk a few examples of kind of where you see some additional value that may not be captured by this methodology. I'll just start off with one that comes to mind. Because the P3 model is covering a 25, 30-year period, it brings a huge amount of predictability to the government owner about their cash flows on that asset, as opposed to having budgets for life cycle costs that could be deferred through the budgeting process So that's a value that, we do capture life cycle costs in this model, but that value of predictive cash flows for the government, I think, is important. You want to add some?
Yeah, and I think that, it is one of the areas where the auditors have a very hard time, I think, rationalizing the value for money calculation because we don't evaluate risk on non-P3 asset procurements. So when you're not comparing apples to apples necessarily, but in the delivery phase of these projects, I can assure you that these risks are very real. And certainly our contractor partners around the room and our facility managers that are in the room will know a decade into P3 procurements in Canada, that these risks do materialize and they can be very significant. And so the value for money calculation attempts to provide an estimate of what those risks are and quantify them with a dollar value. But ultimately at the end of the day, I think what this model does do very well is it does contractually incentivize the project co to manage its risks appropriately and to be keeping track of those risks and how the project is progressing against them. So for example, if you go into project delivery, so if you've won a project and you're at risk for, let's say, permitting, and you get off to a late start with the permitting, if Project Co is at least partially at risk for permitting, then you are incentivized to work together with the owner on finding a solution to get your permitting done because you still maintain risk on delivery of that project on time and on budget. So.
I think I'd echo that with the risk transfer in particular, that transferring risk to the party that's best able to handle that risk and mitigate the risk is probably one of the hallmarks of the P3 procurement route. You transfer the risk of operations and maintenance to a service provider. You transfer the risks of design build to a design build joint venture, and having a clearly defined risk transfer to those individuals who are, as you noted, then incentivized to complete the project on time and in a particular manner, I think is a true value that is often overlooked.
I think for me, on the public sector side, one of the learnings I think of these projects that a lot of our clients have taken beyond the P3 realm is looking at risk allocation. Perhaps it's recognizing that sometimes you should look at risk issues differently than you have traditionally looked at them. Sometimes it's recognizing that maybe there is value in transferring risks that the public sector owner may have traditionally carried, like permitting risk or utility risk or environmental contamination risk, but also recognizing that that there are boundaries to what's possible in doing that. I think sometimes people drink too much of the P3 Kool-Aid and believe that it's really a way to transfer all the risk in a project, and it certainly isn't that way. But there are definite learnings, I think, that go beyond sort of the specific P3 project that can be applied sort of more traditionally to big infrastructure projects, for sure.
So we're going to turn over to questions in a minute or two, so just think about any questions you may have. I was just going to make one other observation, kind of a value for money that isn't captured in this calculation is some of the productivity improvements it's brought to our construction industry. In fact, we've got Plenary now established initially in Vancouver and Toronto, but now you're quite active on projects in the US. So it's also created a lot of homegrown Canadian capability that's exportable.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's, we've seen for ourselves and for our partners, I think a big learning curve, and it's one of the concerns I think that smaller and medium-sized contractors have when governments start to do P3s in their areas, how they will compete. But I think that across the board where we are seeing more projects, in jurisdictions where we're seeing more projects, those contractors have really increased their ability to manage risk and to manage project delivery. And so it's a huge benefit to them when they export those services to new markets. And certainly, our partners including PCL, who's a great partner of ours across Canada. We're looking at projects in the US, and we've just completed our first project with PCL in Australia, which was a huge new innovative cancer center project. So we do see a lot of value in those partnerships forming, and I think that as you look across the market, you see those partnerships continuing, a decade into this delivery model. So people have really understood how to support each other in delivery.
That's great. Thank you. So we have about 5 or so minutes left here, if there's questions from the floor on any aspect of value for money, or
Everybody to sleep already.
Thank you.
yeah.
The last discussion, you were making a statement about Cancer Center in Australia. Can you run through the example a little bit? How did they calculate the value for money, and how did they land on doing P3?
Yeah. So I think large, complex hospital projects are a really good example of where the P3 model has been very well applied in the last decade. In North America, in Australia, across the US, they're starting to get into these kinds of assets, and then also in the UK. And the thing with these projects is that obviously, the procuring authorities, so if you are a hospital or a health region, you don't procure billion-dollar capital assets every day, right? So I think that there is, the process does drive those clients to really think about what it is that they're looking for from their facility, how the facility is going to operate, how their staff is going to operate when they're delivering services to their clients or to the public. And so those are really intangible value that P3s can drive. But then also on the delivery side, so large healthcare facilities in Canada are almost all LEED designed, so to at least a LEED silver, if not LEED gold or LEED platinum design level. So we're seeing huge savings on the operations and maintenance costs of those facilities against the existing buildings that they're replacing. We see shortened schedules on delivery time. So generally, if you're delivering a large or even medium-sized healthcare facility in Canada, you're on a 2.5 to 3.5 year delivery timeline, which is very, very quick. We delivered a hospital, a large, almost 2 million square foot hospital in just north of Toronto in 3.5 years. And I think that that's really the standard for delivery of these projects right now. So people are getting the assets that they need in the communities to actually have better access to care, better access to education, and ultimately that's really the driver for doing this. I mean, it's not so much. We are not the driver for the P3 model. This is really a model that was developed by governments to provide better predictability, accountability, and better asset delivery for taxpayers.
Thanks. Any other questions? Here we go.
Thank you very much for the panel discussion. Obviously today the Premier announced entering into this space with a number of schools. I would equate Manitoba, we're not new to this, but we're kind of really baby crawling, and obviously we've decided to stand up and we're starting to walk now. But speaking of some of the things that you touched on in terms of traditional models of public sector procurement and approaches to these kinds of projects, what advice would you have for Manitoba in particular? How do we work with our public sector entities to educate, build trust, and because they're really going to help determine the success of this model in many ways, and so there might be some resistance. How do we work with those public sector entities so that when we really move into this space in a big way, we're going to be successful?
Yeah, I'll start off. Maybe I think the key point there is engagement, right? And we did talk about this earlier about the output specifications. It's kind of a new world for a lot of governments in terms of how they look at their assets, and I think it's a great opportunity to get engagement. And I know on hospital projects, it's a key thing is to get engagement from not just the health authority itself, but the practitioners that are in the hospital. So we get output specifications that are going to work for them day to day in the field, operating the hospital. And I think the same goes for schools as well. I think everyone, involved in delivery of education in a school, from the teachers to the janitors. I mean, janitors play, the Premier mentioned today, play a huge role in the performance of a school, believe it or not. I remember working on the Alberta education school bundles there, the ASAP projects, and that was a key point, was to ensure that there was a full engagement of all the stakeholders involved with the schools. So, any other thoughts from the panel?
My advice would be to reach out to your colleagues in the rest of Canada who have done P3 projects. I mean, one of the benefits of where you are now is that lots of projects have been done in lots of different asset classes across the country. You have some expertise here in Winnipeg at the city who have done their own projects. Reach out to them, reach out to your colleagues in the neighboring provinces, because there is so much learning that goes on, and so much of it is about planning and being ready for all of these different stages, making sure that you have a governance structure in place that is going to facilitate the project. And really, I do think that you have the opportunity, unlike maybe 10 years ago when, there was first-in-class projects happening constantly. Everybody was like, okay, well, this is the first courthouse, so let's see how it goes. This was the first wastewater treatment plant. Let's see how it goes. You don't have that now, right? You can phone somebody who's done a hospital or a big civil project or a wastewater treatment plant and get some advice.
Yeah. And maybe the one other thing is to not underestimate the value of the local community and the local contractor community as well. I mean, certainly, we see that as I think something where there's a lot of trepidation ahead of P3s being implemented, but actually we see it as a win-win in the jurisdictions that are doing it properly. And I think it's a win for the taxpayer, and it's a win for those companies, and getting them involved early and helping them to understand where they can play a role and what the requirements are going to be on them is something that jurisdictions like Saskatchewan have done very well, I think.
I would follow on that as well, that all the projects we've been involved in Saskatchewan have local partners, both on the design, the contracting side, and the service provider side. So I think you can see that success, that these people didn't come in and operate in a vacuum and just say, I'm an expert in this field, I don't need any of your help. They found somebody that was local, that understood the local conditions, the subtrade markets, the building codes, the engineering requirements of that location, and they worked together with the local community of professionals to develop these projects. I think that's really key. And they also, from our government standpoint, I know we didn't operate in a vacuum either. We took lessons learned and best practices from Infrastructure Ontario and Partnerships BC, other municipalities across the country that worked on these types of projects prior to Saskatchewan doing them, and tried to take the best of what was done and apply that across the province.
So there you have it. So I think that, is there time for one quick question? Okay.
Just quickly, several times today we've heard mention of being $120 million under budget on the rapid transit project here. It seems to me that while that money's tied up in the budget for that project, that it's destroying the value of that money, where it could be put to work on other projects. Is there anything on the private side contractually that prevents that money from being released to other projects in real time right now?
No, I mean, well, it's really, I would look to the city of Winnipeg, how they do their budgeting here, but certainly that $120 million savings, whatever the number is again, it's a result of comparing the estimate of what the project would have been under traditional versus what the bid came in at the end. And I know some of the granting, P3 Canada grants, it's on a percentage of the final capital costs that come in. So it may have actually been, the P3 Canada probably had a larger grant expectation initially going to that project. When the final dollar value came out, it was a savings for them too, so to speak. So, but how that gets redistributed, it's up to the owner, I guess.
There are so many needs in municipal governments. There are so many demands on capital that I'm sure that money will be reallocated to other priorities as well.
I will say, though, there probably is some allocation of that savings to as a contingency for, because even in a P3 model, there's still a certain amount of retained risk by the municipality. And it's important that, that the government, municipality, et cetera, be able to budget accordingly for potential risks that occur. Yep, Marianne's looking at me.
Nope.
Well, I think that brings us to the end. So would you please join me in thanking the panel for their insights?